See. Okay. Just a few more minutes, waiting for everyone else to come on. Still a little early. No. Welcome Sherry. Welcome Iris. Welcome Diane. Are you from the Villages? Puerto Vallarta? Yeah? Okay. Phil? Gail? Stu? Sandy Horowitz? Daron is our speaker. Chabad Puerto Vallarta, who is joining us today. Waverland Peters, Elaine Villa, Jackie Wasserman, Tila Hecht, Bob Levinson, Rick Walsh, Susan's iPhone, Bonnie Stein, Raquel S. I see you only by the names that you put, if you don't have your screen on. Hello? Okay, we got 2 more minutes. People are still signing on. Just give everyone a chance to get on. Okay. I think we're about ready to start at 7 o'clock. So welcome everyone. Welcome those of you who are joining from Ocala, from the Villages, from nearby areas. We also have joining with us some people from the community in Chabad of Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. My brother happens to be the Chabad rabbi there, Rabbi Schneier Hecht. And for those of you who are here in our community, we will be hearing from him a week from Tuesday, God willing. At 7 o'clock, we'll have a special talk from him, and we'll be able to hear and meet some of the people from the Jewish community in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. With the way the weather's been here locally, I think probably some of us would wish we're in Puerto Vallarta at this point, but thank God it's got a little better. I want to also remind everyone here that we have a course beginning this Sunday at 11 o'clock, a 5-week course entitled How Happiness Thinks. And it's about being happy even in times of challenges and difficulty. And there probably hasn't been time more challenging for many of us than the time we're in now. I want to give a special thank you to Daron Kornbluth, who is the featured lecturer today. Everyone say hello to him. Daron is right now in Israel, where it is 2 o'clock in the morning. And so it's not easy for him to be here. So we do appreciate him taking the opportunity to do this. I want to give a little bit introduction to Daron. First, tell him a little bit about our community. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about Daron. He is world renowned on this subject. He wrote a number of books on this. He has a website on this. And me personally, as a Chabad rabbi, have gained personally from what Daron has to offer. He helped put together a course called Journey of the Soul, which I taught a number of times, right? Am I correct about that?
They used a bunch of my material. I didn't do it.
Yes, I know. Okay. And I've listened to some of his lectures in the past, and I gained a tremendous amount of information from him. Daron, just so you know, as I had told you, as I had messaged you, the villages is one of the largest retirement communities in the world, if not the largest retirement community in the world, with over 150,000 retirees who live here. Although a small percentage of them being Jewish, nevertheless, it's still a good amount. And these are questions that come up every day. And I always say, you know, when these questions come up at the last minute, so it's a lot more difficult to make the right decision. But if we make the right decisions earlier on, and we put things and we make it clear to family and children what these decisions should be, then it's a lot easier for everyone. And I'm sure you'll be touching upon that as well. You know, just recently we had a situation with someone who we were dealing with in this issue, and I think that you know, the times that I do speak about it, and people come to me afterwards and, you know, say, I simply just didn't know anything about it, and I didn't know that Torah has a view on this matter. And so it's so important, and I hope those who are here joining us will share with friends and relatives as well that which you hear today. And of course, if you have questions, you'll be able to present them, and you'll be able to hopefully reach out to Daron directly or to myself. I want to also welcome Chabad Puerto Vallarta, who has as well also a retirement community that's growing there. My brother Schneier is a Chabad rabbi in Puerto Vallarta. You could see him there. And there are a number of people from Puerto Vallarta who are joining us as well. So at this point, without further ado, I will give it up to Daron.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. A pleasure to be with everybody. Can I just get a thumbs up if you can hear me clearly, everybody? Just let me know that this whole system's working over here. And I see people, all right, that looks looking pretty good. I see a bunch of thumbs. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Daron. It is a pleasure to be here with you. Rabbi, thank you very much for inviting me. And it's a nice surprise that the Chabad of Puerto Vallarta are here. Pleasure. I didn't know you guys were there. That's great. I'm, ladies and gentlemen, have you ever heard the phrase that dog is man's best friend? You've heard that phrase, famous phrase, right? I've actually discovered recently that it's not true. Coffee is man's best friend. It is 2 a.m. here in the Holy Land. If you're feeling bad for me, don't. I actually slept for 4 hours, woke up, having a drink. I'm awake and raring to go. So, I'm doing fine. It's nice to be here with you. It's especially nice because this isn't an easy topic, meaning that there's a story that I once heard of this gentleman who's on his bed, and he calls over to his wife. He says, "Honey, come sit beside me on the bed." Kind of a strange request. So, she's curious. She sits beside him. He says, "Honey, do you remember when we were in our 20s and I broke my leg and you were there with me?" "Yes, honey, I was." "And do you remember when we were in our 40s and I went bankrupt and you were there with me?" "Yes, honey, I was." "And do you remember when we were in our 50s and I had my heart attack and you were there with me?" "Yes, honey, I was." "Well, I have something important to tell you." And a tear rolls down her cheek and she leans in and he says, "Honey, you're bad luck." Meaning, there are some subjects they just seem like they're bad. I know it's a terrible joke, but what else? So there's some subjects that just seem like they're taboo, like it's uncomfortable. We'd rather not talk about them, rather not deal with them. A comedian once said, "I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve it through not dying." Right? We don't want to go there. Don't want to think about it. So people are reluctant to talk about this issue. And that's why I am so glad that we're all here together. As you indicated, Rabbi, better to be informed than not informed in order to make decisions today. And especially today, because something has changed. For thousands of years, Jews always buried the dead. We were known as the people who buried the dead. Roman historian Tacitus, when he described us to his compatriots, one of the few outstanding characteristics was that the Jews bury rather than burn the dead. And this was always true. Jews always buried for over 3,000 years, almost 4,000 years. So until recently. In the last generation or two, things have changed dramatically. When all of us were kids, cremation rates in general were very low in America, and amongst Jews were radically low, a few percent. That's all it was. And yet in our lifetimes, in a generation or two, suddenly the percentage that are being cremated is much higher. Over 50%, it's something like 52 or 53% of all Americans who die, Christians, Jews, whatever, are being cremated today. It's more than half. The Jewish community is not that high, but is not as far behind as we think. I'm not going to belabor you with statistics tonight, but I'll give you just one or two to think about, okay? Rabbi Elchanan Zon, who's sort of the rabbi's rabbi on these subjects, he's the head of the Burial Society in New York and nationally the association. So he did an informal study about 10 years ago, and he found that in Jewish funeral homes in the New York area, 25% of the requests were for cremation. By the way, did you notice all those conditions? It's 10 years ago. It's gone up since then. That was in people who are affiliated enough to choose a Jewish funeral home. And that's in the New York area, the most Jewishly affiliated, culturally Jewish part of the country. There is no doubt nationally that amongst the Jewish dead in the US today, it is at least 1 out of 3 that are being cremated, and it is most likely something like 35 to 40%. So my question for you is why? And what I love about Zoom, I don't know if you're on Zoom 10 hours a day or this is your first time, but what I love about Zoom is that although we are stuck far apart from each other, it's actually surprisingly interactive. And the way that we love to do it is the chat. So you should have a chat function. For me, it's on the bottom of my screen, and you can chat to everyone, or to me personally if it's private, or just chat to everyone. And I want you to tell me, and I'm going to look at your answers. I want you to tell me, why are people today, of all religions, backgrounds, Westerners, why are people in the West, America, why are Americans today choosing cremation more than ever? Radical change, 10 times as high as when we were kids. So I see Somebody said price. Absolutely. We'll just talk about it. Why else? These may be reasons that you've thought about, that your loved ones have thought about, that you've heard people talking about in the media, movies. So that's my question for you. Please type it in and tell me what you think. Why are people today choosing cremation, right? The cost, people are saying it's more accepted by all, so more accepted by us, very well put. Lack of Jewish affiliation, I see. Stephen, you wrote. Cheaper, Barry wrote. Jill is writing, families don't live close together anymore, right? And cost, absolutely. So again, we're going to have to do this by chat for now. Later, we'll open it up at the end for questions and comments. But right now, we'll just type it in because thank God there's a beautiful, beautiful crowd. It's the only way to do things. Kids will not visit anyway, the rabbi says. I assume that's land conservation, Barbara, is what you meant, right? Better use of lands. Very good. Wow, this is an impressive crowd. Just in a few minutes, you got I think all the main ones. Families are dispersed. Land. Excellent. Okay, so let's go through. This is what we're going to do in the next short time that we have together. We're going to divide our time together into three. First, I want to analyze the reasons that you just gave, and this is very, very common. These similar reasons come up every time I talk about it. I'm being invited to speak about the subject at least once a week now to communities around the world. It's a very in-demand subject, for better or worse. And this is generally the typical reasons that I hear from all around the world. So the first section of what we're going to do is we're going to analyze the reasons that you just gave as to why many people today of all religions and backgrounds, why they are choosing cremation. We're going to see, and I'm completely honest and transparent, we're going to see some of them are more valid than others. And some of them make some logical sense and some of them don't. And we're going to analyze them briefly. That's the first stage of what we're going to do. Then we're going to flip the script and say and ask, why have Jews for thousands of years focused on burial? There's the first section, we're going to analyze the people choose cremation. Second section, we're going to say, okay, so why have Jews focused on burial? And then we're going to open it up to questions and comments. Everybody get it? That's the vein system. So let's go through the reasons that, very briefly, I'm going to give you resources at the end of where you can find more information. But let me give you, let's go through your reasons briefly. Okay, first, some people mentioned cost. Let's just leave that for now, till the end. Okay, several of you mentioned land, environmental issues, right? Rick just wrote clean and environmentally friendly, right? So there are indeed two issues that are mentioned in terms of the environment. And, I grew up in in my community we were like into this kind of stuff, and I care about the environment. It speaks to me. And there's two separate critiques of burial that relate to the environment. So let's go through them. The first one is the amount of land that is used, meaning we are let's just talk about the states for now. We are we have a limited amount of land, and we have a growing population, and we are running out of land gradually. And why waste land on dead bodies who don't need it? Leave it for the birds and the trees and the playgrounds and the parks. It's a moral argument, actually, right? There just isn't enough land. We're running out. So save the land. Why waste the land on my body? My body's not going to need it. I'm going to be dead, right? So the truth is that it's a powerful argument because it's a moral argument. And you and I both know that Judaism has a great value on life, right? When a Jew has a drink, what do we say? L'chaim, to life, right? So if you had to choose between land being for the dead and land being for the living, you hear the point. The only problem is I actually ran the numbers. I'm not the first person to do so, but I did run the numbers. And I've been speaking about this subject since 2012. My book on the subject came out. I wrote a book called Cremation or Burial, A Jewish View, and it came out in 2012. And since that time, in every talk that I give, I mention these numbers, and my book's been out. And I've never once been called out on these numbers, meaning to my knowledge, these numbers are so solid, like they're irrefutable. And again, they're verified, whatever. Here's the number. I'm gonna give you one simple stat, okay? If every American who died, and I'm not talking to every American right now, I'm speaking to the Jewish community, which is about 1.5% of the population, right? It's nothing. But if every American who died, roughly 3 million people, this past year, it was a high year, relatively speaking, we all know why. If every American who died were to be buried, it would take, get this, 10,000 years to use up 1% of America's landmass. Do you get that stat? If all Americans who died, 340 million Americans, however many die every year, right? If every American who died, it would take 10,000 years to use up 1% of America's landmass. There is a tremendous amount of land. This is true in North America. This is true in South America. This is true in Europe. This is true in Africa. This is true in Asia. This is true in Australia. The only places that this isn't true, actually, to my knowledge, are Singapore, Hong Kong, and a few parts of Japan. And by the way, there's solutions there. Okay, it's not a huge problem, actually. Meaning, if you had to choose, I hear the question, but you don't have to choose. There is a tremendous amount of land. True, if you want to be buried in downtown Manhattan or downtown Miami, you've got a problem. Land is at a premium. Look at the land prices. But how often do you go to a cemetery anyway? I mean, like, you go every day? That's a little strange. And I like going to cemeteries, actually. Don't worry, I don't go every day. I'm not a weirdo. But it means something to me. I connect to it. But I mean, you can't drive half an hour outside of town. In every metropolitan area, within 30 minutes or 60 minutes, there's plenty of room for cemeteries right outside of metropolitan limits. There's plenty of room. By the way, if you doubt me, next time that finally, God willing, when we'll be able to fly again, remember what it was like to get on airplanes and fly? Look down. There's a tremendous amount of land in this country. We use more land by far for Walmarts and big box stores and things like that, right? So there's no problem with extra cemeteries. You do not have to go. I see somebody said that, where you have to go. You do not have to go out to the desert or out to Wyoming. There's plenty of place all over Florida for people in Florida and all over New York within half an hour of where people are. There is no issue. By the way, serious environmentalists do not even mention this because they know the reality, okay? Cremation societies, they call themselves societies. They're for-profit organizations, billion-dollar industry. They talk about this. Land is for the living, right? Because they're trying to get your business. But the truth is there's no land issue. It's not a serious issue amongst environmentalists at all. The real environmental critique, and this is number 2, of burial is much more serious. See if you notice the commonality of these problems. There's 2 main problems that environmentalists are very critical of when it comes to burial, to modern American burials. Number 1, metal caskets. It takes an enormous amount of energy of metals to make all these caskets, right? Thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands, right? They have to be formed, to be melted, to be put into the ground. They rust for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Terrible for the environment, no question, right? Number 2, embalming. Forgive me for getting a little bit, gross. Because of the subject, we're gonna have to deal with this stuff a little bit. So embalming is when they remove the liquids, basically the blood from a body, replace it with preservatives. Formaldehyde, by the way, is the classic. And it's still used in many, many places. And it makes the body decompose slower. It still decomposes, right? The body still goes away, but it just makes it last longer. Toxic chemicals, formaldehyde, toxic chemicals, gallons and gallons going into the ground, right? Terrible for the environment. Embalming and metal caskets, by far the main 2 environmental problems of modern burial, horrible for the environment. Absolutely. Anybody notice anything about these two things? Metal caskets and embalming. Rabbis, you are not allowed to answer this question. Anybody else notice anything? What do these two things have in common? I see Murray is shaking his head. They're not Jewish. We don't do either. Jewish burial has always been considered and is a model of environmentalism. Environmentalists are not in favor of cremation. Cremation releases toxic chemicals into the air. There was an article yesterday that Los Angeles, California, temporarily allowed the breaking of the cremation, how many cremations could happen in a day because of air pollution. Because normally there's a law that you're only allowed a certain number of cremations a day because of air pollution, right? Many municipalities do not allow crematoriums beside schools because it's dangerous. If you're my age or older, and it looks like many of us are of the similar generation, and if you have a filling in your teeth, over here you got a filling, it's probably got mercury in it. For younger people, they don't use mercury anymore. But in my generation, they did use mercury, right? Terrible for the environment. No wonder they don't allow schools to be built besides crematorium. So environmentalists are not in favor of cremation. It uses a tremendous amount of fossil fuels. We're all getting rid of our combustible cars and getting hybrids and getting Teslas, right? Suddenly you have to use fossil fuels to burn a body for hours, as we'll discuss. And it uses a lot of energy and it destroys the environment. Environmentalists are in favor of what's called green burials. What is a green burial? A green burial means no metal caskets, no embalming. Those are the classic two things. Jews don't do either, right? We want simple metal, we want simple wood caskets, pine bat. We don't consider that embalming is respectful to the dead. By the way, if you're masochistic and you want to understand why, go on YouTube, watch an embalming for 5 minutes. You will understand exactly why we don't do it, okay? It's not rocket science, okay? So environmentalists are not in favor of cremation, uses too much energy, too many chemicals, toxic chemicals going into the air, right? Green burial, main two character traits of green burial, no metal caskets, no embalming. Judaism scores high on the scale of disposal of the dead, okay? The next thing, that's the environmental things. There's many more, but those are by far the main two issues by far. Okay, then the other issues that you mentioned, some people mentioned that like the kids or the grandkids are not going to visit the cemetery, or nobody lives, where I am. By the way, where you are, Florida, has relatively high cremation rates. And one of the explanations, there's many, one of the explanations is that there are so many retirees in Florida. So people say, where am I going to be buried? Here in Florida? I've only been here for 5-10 years. Everybody I know is older and is going to die soon anyway. My kids are back in New York. I haven't lived there for a while. I don't know anybody there anymore, right? How long are they going to last? My grandkids are out in the West. Like, where am I going to go? Like, there's no point. Nobody's going to visit my grave. And let's be honest, people today are not as observant and generally, not as traditional. When I was growing up, we used to go to the family plot, right? There was a family, I'm from Montreal originally. And even when I just visited my parents for the first time in a year, I was able to get in 2-week quarantine in an Airbnb before I could see my folks. And I went to the cemetery, and there's a family plot in the cemetery. They've been there for a few generations. So it's a very sweet, nice idea from the old country. How many people have family plots anymore, right? People change cities like we used to change shirts, so where are you going to go, right? This is a real one. So I want to test your Jewish knowledge. Use the chat box and see if you can answer this question. Okay. Well, you know what? We don't have to do chat. We can do a true or false. Okay. Thumbs up will be true. You think what I'm about to say is true, and thumbs down, right, will be false. So true or false? My favorite place here in Israel to visit is the grave of Moses. The grave of the Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu. It's my favorite place to visit here in Israel. Thumbs up if you think it's true what I'm saying. Thumbs down if you think it's false. I see some bunch of thumbs down and a few thumbs up. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, it was a trick question, guys. I'm sorry. The grave of Moses is not in Israel. At the end of the Bible, the end of the Torah, it makes it clear that he never made it into this country. In normal times, we could just hop on a plane and get here, no problem. He went up to the mountain, was looking into the promised land. Martin Luther King Jr. used that phrasing for his famous speech, right? That's the end of the Bible. He never made it in. There's another reason why you could have known that what I said was false, and that's because we don't know where he's buried. It's actually made very clear that no one knows where his burial place is. The commentators explain that because Moses was such a great prophet, God knew that it would become a place of idol worship. And he didn't want people to start doing idol worship at that place. So he hid the place of Moses' grave. So ask yourself this question. Has anyone ever visited the grave of Moses in 3,300 years? And the answer is no, never. And yet, archaeologically, we know that at that time, 3,300 years ago, there was plenty of cremation in the world. It's clear that was the norm. Yet God did not choose cremation. He chose burial. Because get this, in our modern minds, 2021, right? We connect two ideas, having a grave and visiting a grave. And we assume in our minds that if no one is going to visit the grave, then why bother having one? And since my kids are not that traditional, or I don't have kids or whatever, right? And they're not the type, and they live in different cities, like why bother? Better to just scatter my ashes or have them take them with them, whatever they want. You hear the point? The only problem is, what did the Moses example prove? These two things actually have nothing to do with each other. There are many important reasons to have a grave, even if nobody's going to visit it. Our greatest hero leader is the great proof of that. No one's ever visited his grave, but it still was important to have one. We're going to learn why. By the way, it's always surprising when someone in the family, it can be one grandkid or one kid, whatever, suddenly gets into like history, Jewish genealogy, wants to go to the cemetery. Somebody gets a little more traditional and connects to it. I hear it a lot. You never know from like every normal family, whatever, So often we're surprised by who's going to visit the grave. But even if not an issue. By the way, mobility, sometimes people think that, well, we'll just, they'll take the urns with them. They'll take me with them, right? It's a sweet idea. And we all want to be remembered, and we will be remembered, right? After our time comes. But just think of it this way, okay? So Judy was the daughter. She was closest to her parents, so she got the two urns, right? Then she gets a little older, and she's going to pass the urns on to the next generation. So she had two urns. Next generation, how many are they going to have? 4. Next generation, 8. Next generation, 16. You get my point, right? Our lives and our homes are simply not meant for the long-term respectful care of cremated remains. They are going to get thrown out, put in a park, put on the ocean, in the garbage, whatever, at some point, right? So the modern mobility has made it challenging, right? But cremation is not the answer. Bodies deserve a grave whether or not they'll be visited, and cremation doesn't solve the problem. Okay, I'm going through the reasons that you chose, and at the beginning of why people are choosing cremation. Remember, I'm just doing the headlines. I'm going to give you resources later for those who want more information. Then we're going to get into the reasons that Jews have focused on burial, and then we'll get to questions and comments. Lack of Jewish affiliation. That's an important one. I see, Stephen, Mr. Bell, you suggested that, and that's true. Less traditional people in general do less traditional things. It's tautological, as they say in the speech world. Like it's a circular thinking, right? I don't know if that's a reason to choose like what I'm going to do with my body, the last decision I'll make on earth, but because, people are doing less, so therefore do less. This is an important one. There's a certain fad of cremation today. Things go, it comes in, comes out, the Asian immigration made it much more normal, and just things it's more normal. It's just a snowball effect, right? It just becomes more common, so people do it. I'm glad that people aren't wearing ties. I hope it's okay that in my formal talk I'm not wearing a tie. I used to wear a tie a lot, and since Corona hit, I find that I'm really only wearing ties once a week. Friday night, the synagogues here are basically closed or very, very limited. So we have a prayer service outside in the parking lot. So Friday night to welcome Shabbat, I put on a tie. That's the only time that I do so. And my kids are always complaining about my ties. My ties are too wide. My ties are too thin. My ties are too wide. My ties are too thin. And I always tell them, I'm not getting rid of these ties, because you and I both know that in 5 years, they're going to be in again, right? There's nothing wrong with the ties. Fads come and fads go, right? And so, that's not a reason to choose what I'm going to do with my body, right? Well, because it happens to be in right now, like, no, like you get some information and you make your decision responsibly, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, as you go through the reasons that you mentioned and that are always mentioned for people that when they, I see one more I missed. I'm just looking at the list now. When I got into this subject, I remember about 10, 12 years ago, I was never focused on this subject. I was an educator, and I would lecture, and I used to travel around speaking. And I most of the topics that I speak on, that I've written about, I wrote a book called Raising Kids to Love Being Jewish, and I speak to parents and grandparents how to raise their kids to love being Jewish. I give talks on happiness. I give talks on relationships. I give talks on why be Jewish. I was never into this subject. And then, when I suddenly started researching this around 2008, 2009, I want to share with you the single biggest surprise that I had when I was researching this subject. I had always thought that a cremation was something like a microwave oven. You put the body in, you put on the timer, and 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds later, out pops the ashes. So forgive me, ladies and gentlemen, but we have to be straight here. I was completely mistaken. A typical cremation of a thin person today, okay, is 60 to 90 minutes. If you're like me and 2020 did a number on your weight, what do they call it? Like the quarantine 19 or COVID-19 for a reason, right? The pounds, right? Then if you're like most of us, when you're overweight, then, it's 2 to 3 hours. For an obese person, it's a BMI of 30 or more, which is a quarter of America, by the way. It's 3 to 4 hours. That's how long a cremation takes. And during that time, forgive me, the body is not calm and placid and spiritual. The muscles are extending and contracting. The brain is sizzling. It is a disgusting procedure. It's not quick. It's not clean. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that burial is pleasant. I remember high school lab class. Decomposition is gross. I'm fully aware of it. I'm just pointing out that they're both kind of gross. The only difference is this, and listen carefully. Burial is the natural way of every living thing. Plants grow, blossom, go back to Mother Earth. An animal is born in the forest, runs around, goes back to Mother Earth. Burial is natural. Cremation is man-made, mechanical, artificial. Kind of interesting, right? So let's summarize this first section. When you go through all the reasons that people choose for cremation, they're actually not true. It's not better for the environment. Doesn't solve mobility problems, right? It is, the fad or the lack of, it doesn't make any sense, except one. There is one reason for cremation that actually is perfectly logical and reasonable and is undeniable. What is that reason, ladies and gentlemen? Everything else falls away. We've gone through them right now, and I'll give you more resources if you want to check. Cost, exactly right. Bonnie asked it right away, answered it right away. Cost. It is undeniable that in 90% of the cases, there are exceptions, by the way, you can do a very expensive cremation, and you can do a very, very simple burial, right? But I see a couple people wrote in toxicity or infection. Ladies and gents, that is it's what they call an urban legend. There is no truth whatsoever to the idea that that burial is a problem. In fact, they've had the opposite problem, that because crematoriums take so long and burn things into the air, they are more afraid of cremation in terms of corona type stuff. There's no evidence whatsoever. No government authority anywhere on planet Earth has outlawed burials because of that, right? You have obviously the people working on the body have to wear masks and social distance. That's obvious. There's no problem with toxicity at all. I've checked this out with the scientists, and you'll see that this is not mainstream talking about. So the only reason that actually is strong out of all the reasons that you listed, and it is a strong reason, is money. Because let's be honest, at the end of the day, a typical burial will cost funeral service, right? The plot, the gravestone, it's gonna cost something like $8,000 to $10,000, if not more. And a cremation usually ends up being 2 to 3. By the way, you can do cremation to 1-800 number, and it's even cheaper. You can go higher. But most people, in most cases, there is at least a $5,000 difference between the two. So that's the main reason behind people's thinking. And it's understandable, especially in the economy today, right? People, like, why put in the extra money? In other words, we've analyzed the reasons for cremation. They don't really make sense, except this one. Burial's more expensive. So why is it worth the extra money? And I would like to make a claim. Gentlemen, when you proposed to your wife and you gave her a ring, I assume that you didn't get it from the bottom of a Cracker Jack box, right? Some things are worth a little money, right? You spent a few bucks on it. So I'm going to make the suggestion that this is one of those things that Diane, I see your husband is like nodding. Does that mean he actually got you a ring from a Cracker Jack box? Oh my gosh, we got to talk after. So the point is, why is it worth the extra money? Now, between you and me, if you're the type that goes to Starbucks, on a regular basis, and believe me, I love Starbucks, okay? It's not a big difference in the long term, right? When you plan it early, and Rabbi, I agree with you, what you mentioned before, this kind of subject, it leads to so much division. The end of life, as hard as it is, should be a beautiful moment of a family coming together. And instead, when things aren't clear, it leads to division and fighting and greed, right? So I suggest to people that you make your wishes extremely, extremely clear. Planned, written, designated, paid for. The little card says, when my time comes, hopefully in a very long time, here's the Chabad rabbi's number, here's his name, here's his Instagram, here's his email, right? He's the one who makes the final decisions and the preparation. I want everything. You pay for it early, pre-planning. It's not a big, it's an extra coffee a week over a few years, and it adds up to the difference. That's what we're talking about over here, okay? But let's talk about, what happens at the end of the time. Let's say, people haven't made this decision and it's a last minute thing. It's much harder. So let's go through the reasons and let's try and understand why, even if you have to, pay that extra money at the end. I'm going to list to you the headlines of a number of topics for information that you want more information about. We're going to have questions and answers later, and I'll give you some resources. Okay, number one. In the Kovno ghetto in World War II, a Nazi SS officer barges in to the little room of Rabbi Ephraim Oshry, who actually survived the war, moved to New York, and told this story. The Nazi SS officer slams the door behind him. Rabbi Oshry thinks it's his last moments on planet Earth. And the Nazi officer starts speaking in perfect Yiddish. Rabbi, I'm a Jew. I look the part, I have fake papers, and this is how I've survived the war. But I'm a very sick man. I only have a few weeks or months to live. And I know exactly what they're going to do to me when I die. They're going to bury me in a Nazi cemetery with a Nazi cross over my body, surrounded by Nazis. Rabbi, I can fake it for a few months to survive the war, but I can't be there forever. Am I allowed to be cremated in order to avoid the fate of being buried in a Nazi cemetery with a Nazi cross over my body forever? And the rabbi took his hands gently and said, my dear, dear son, my dear child, no, you can't. We have no control over what they do to us, but a Jew must do whatever he or she can to have proper Jewish burial, even if that means a Nazi cemetery. Obviously, we try and be in a Jewish cemetery and get everything done, and a little bit of land from the land of Israel and the rabbi saying the prayers. But in the time of the Holocaust, at least, now this is not a guilt trip, ladies and gentlemen. If you chose cremation for your spouse, God forbid, or if they chose it, or your parents, or you've thought about it yourselves, believe it or not, like Judaism, Jews, we are not into guilt. I know that's very funny because we always talk about Jewish guilt, but it's actually not a Jewish thing, right? What do we say when we have a drink? L'chaim. We're not focused on the past so much. Focus on the future. So if you chose cremation, if they chose cremation, don't beat yourselves up. Make a donation to the local Chabad. He didn't ask me to say that. I just, they deserve it. In their memory, and move on. Let's focus on the future. L'chaim, right? It's not about guilt. But what Rashi was explaining was that we have to do whatever we can to have proper burial. And he cited verse after verse. For those who want to look it up, one of the main text sources in the Bible, it's not the only one, by the way, is Deuteronomy 21:22. The death penalty in Judaism is a largely deterrent measure, right? The Talmud says that if a community would put someone to death once in 70 years, it's too much. Meaning it's a crazy case when they can fill all the conditions. Even in the case when it happens, you don't cremate, you take the body down and you bury that body. All the more so everybody else, right? By the way, this is true for non-Jews as well. For Jews, this is a core part of Judaism. Verse after verse, it's all over the Talmud. Maimonides, the Code of Jewish Law. It's this is a mitzvah, believe it or not. It's not just a custom or, the Jews always did this, right? We eat bagels. I mean, okay, but 1,000 years ago, Jews didn't eat bagels, No, this is actually a core part of our religion, a surprisingly important part. When a new Jewish community is formed, what are the things it's supposed to do first? A Jewish school for kids, a ritual bath, a mikveh, and a burial society. It's that important. If I was creating a religion, I don't know if I'd really care what you do with the dead. But our tradition, our religion very much does. Abraham buried Sarah, Abraham is buried, Rachel is buried, Jacob is buried, time after time. This is like a big subject. By the way, this is a subject that has filtered through into Jewish consciousness. Anybody recognize the name Gilad Shalit? Gilad Shalit was that poor boy. He just got married, I believe. He was a soldier, an Israeli soldier that was captured by Hamas and was in jail in a Hamas dungeon for 5 years. And we in Israel, we made a big exchange for him. 2,000 terrorists were exchanged to get him back, right? Very controversial decision here in Israel, by the way. Obviously, we're happy that he's alive and well and has a life, obviously. But not so simple to release that many terrorists, right? 200 of them have already been rearrested for terrorist crimes. Okay, it's not so simple. Most people have heard that story. But get this, you may not have heard that several times in Israel's history, we have exchanged hundreds of live terrorists to get back bodies. soldiers we knew were dead to give them proper burial. It's that much a part of who we are as Jews, of our tradition. That's the first reason that Jews are big on burial. It's a core part of our religion, of our heritage. It's an important mitzvah. It's not just a minor thing. So number two, anybody ever been to a Jewish funeral and seen the mourners, M-O-U-R, seen the mourners tear kriya, or if you've been in that situation, sadly, yourself, right? So God forbid someone dies, and the mourners, the close relatives, right? So that's, brother, sister, mother, father, God forbid, son, daughter, spouse, right? The 7 relatives. The mourners tear kriya. Kriya is, literally, kriya means tearing. So it's a funny phrase, like tearing a tear. That's what it means, really, right? So the mourners tear kriya. And by the way, I don't know what you've seen. I know that in recent years, I've noticed this trend that the funeral home or whatever, somebody, gives the mourner a little ribbon and pins it on and then cuts the ribbon, right? Similar idea. Again, it's not our main subject tonight, but just for your information, it's a very sweet idea. It's coming from a good place. It's actually not the tradition. That's not the point. The point is not that someone gives me a ribbon that wasn't mine and you cut it and then the point is it's supposed to be my clothing. It's supposed to be my outer garment. I am torn, right? I am torn. And it's hurtful and it's painful and I'm losing something like that. So I want you to imagine the following visual. When a person dies, the earth itself tears kriya. A wound is opened up on the planet itself. There is a hole, a gaping wound. It is not okay. It is not normal. Right? And then slowly, carefully, lovingly, the rabbi, community members, friends, family, put the earth back on top of the body. Healing begins, but there is always a gravestone. There is always a scar. The person is never forgotten. They've made a difference in the world. The earth itself tears kriya. It's a beautiful idea when you think about it. To me, this teaches an idea. The idea is that healthy societies need the presence of the dead, the experience of death and funerals and burial. In the modern world, there are 2 opposing tendencies about death. On the one hand, we don't want to deal with it, so we speed it up. That's cremation. Get it done, right? Instead of 7 days of Shiva, right? Do 3 days, do 1 day, do an afternoon, do a memorial service next month, right? Do it online. I mean, that's understandable today. But there's one tendency to speed things up. I don't like this subject, right? Someone once called it the toilet assumption. It's unpleasant, so let's flush it away. Let's get rid of this subject. So speed it up, cremation, 1 day, whatever. The other approach is often, I don't accept this. I want to fight it. That's metal caskets, right? Make it last a little longer. That's embalming, make the body decompose slower. That's mausoleums above ground. It'll take longer to decompose. Obviously, they still will decompose. Right? All of these things are slowing it down. I don't like death. I want to fight it. So at first glance, these 2 approaches in the modern world seem opposite. Speed it up, slow it down. But you know what? At the core, they're actually the same. Both approaches are based on the idea, I don't accept this. I'm going to fight it. I'm going to have control of it. Judaism says the opposite. Judaism says 6 days a week, you build the world, you're out there. And one day you just sit back, 7th day, and accept, I'm not running the world. I'm not in control. All our lives, we're running around, pushing, doing, active. And at the end of our lives, we say, I am not going to try and speed this up. I am not going to try and slow this down. I am not going to employ electricity, button and control and mechanics. I'm going to accept God's judgment. Lay me gently down to peace. So that's the second reason. Third reason, if you were to make two maps, a map of monotheistic belief, where people believe in one God, versus where people believe in many gods or no God, and you were to make another map of burial, those two maps would overlap exceptionally closely. Just think about it. The Far East, India, Japan, whatever, polytheism, belief in many gods, cremation is the norm. Europe, while it was Christian Europe, cremation was outlawed for 1,500 years since Charlemagne. The Catholic Church didn't allow cremation. It was unheard of in Europe, right? It's only the last 50 years from below, post-Christian Europe, atheist, whatever, cremation has become the norm. Even in the States, by the way, the Bible Belt has far higher burial rates than the quote unquote secular coasts. There's a natural connection between belief in God and burial. There's exceptions to every rule, but the rule is very strong. And I think the reason is pretty simple. The Bible says at the beginning, the Torah says at the beginning, that every human being is created in the image of God. Right? It doesn't mean that God has a physical image, God forbid, God's God. But our physical image, there's something holy about the human being, something special about the human being, about the divine image. You don't mess with that divine image. You don't stick it in an oven. You lay it gently down to sleep. When you were 8 years old and your pet dog died, I can virtually guarantee that your mother did not say, okay, honey, you bring the body over, I'll fire up the barbecue. Like, that didn't happen, right? What did you do? You buried the dog. Because get this, we bury treasure, we burn the garbage. A Torah scroll that is damaged beyond repair, what do you do with it? You bury it. Remember Katrina, there were Torah scrolls that were destroyed after the hurricane? We buried them. You bury things you love, you bury treasure, we burn the garbage. So, ladies and gents, what we've done now, and we're approaching the question answer period, we went through the reasons why more and more people are choosing cremation today. And we discovered that when you go through them one by one, they actually don't make sense. It's not better for the environment, doesn't solve mobility problems. Visiting is a separate issue. We went one by one. I think we did them all. If we missed any, I'll just mention them now and we'll review them. Except one. In general, it's true that burial is more expensive. So I've been trying to understand and trying to explain, why is it that Jews have focused on burial so much for thousands of years that we say it's worth the extra money? Number one, core part of who we are. Core part of our religion, not a minor custom. Huge, all over the Bible, all over the Talmud. I mean, major, major thing, right? Number two, the idea that the earth itself is tearing kriya. People lose something when they ignore this. They go back to work the next day. They don't have cemeteries. They don't have funeral services. They don't have Shiva, right? You just go on. There's no closure. Healthy societies need the presence of the dead, need the experience of going through with mourning, right? People say they don't want to be a burden to their kids. Ladies and gents, I want to tell you something. I learned this from Thomas Lynch, who's a Christian undertaker and prize-winning poet in Michigan. And, he said the following. He said, if a kid can't have the burden of bearing his or her parents, right, what kind of burden will they ever be able to handle? Like, isn't that what life's about? This is proper education and proper guidance. Being part of a community. I'll end with one idea. So I don't know where I got this from, but I have this monologue in my head where an older Jewish gentleman says to his kids, right? Listen, guys, I want to be serious for a second. I may not have been the most religious Jew on planet Earth. Some things I did, some things I didn't do. I didn't have much of an education. Maybe looking back, I would do things differently. Maybe not, I don't know. But there's one thing I know. I was born a Jew. I'm proud to be a Jew. And when I die, I want to be buried as Jews have been buried for thousands of years. I want the Hebrew prayers to be said. I want the little bit of dirt from the land of Israel. I want the Hebrew date. I want it all done right because I want my last statement on planet Earth to be, I may not have been a perfect Jew, but I'm a proud Jew. So to me, ladies and gentlemen, that's very touching, and I hear it. I may not have been a perfect Jew, but here lies a proud Jew. So when you go through it, the reasons that people choose cremation all fall away. They're not true, except for money. Burial generally costs more. In the long term, it's not a huge difference, by the way, but it does generally cost more. I suggest there's dozens of reasons I just don't have time to get into. In the questions and answers, we can deal with more if you want. But these are some of the reasons why Jews have focused on burial. So I want to thank you for joining and spending the evening together. And Rabbi, thank you for hosting. How do we want to do questions and comments, Rabbi? You want to let people unmute, or you want, is it too much? You want to just do chats, or how do you want to do it?
Well, first of all, thank you, Daron. Before we go to questions, I just want to add one more thing, that if anyone here is wants to talk about their personal situation, feel free to give me a call or an email, and I'll be happy to sit down and talk with you. And I will also say that there have been cases in the past where people have wanted to have a burial, but for whatever reason, their finances did not allow it. And we were able to help them or get them assistance in that way and get them a burial for a much less than what it was actually costing them, and we were able to get them a proper burial. So if that is actually an issue, if the money is actually an issue, so let's sit down and talk about it and see how we can still make that happen and still get you a proper burial. And I see Daron put peacefulreturn.org, which that's your website, right?
Yeah, so I wanted to mention that if you're looking for Jewish information online, the best resource, of course, is Chabad.org. It's unbelievable how much is there on this subject. They actually have a few things by me. There's a video of me speaking about it. There's a few articles, things like that, and from some other people as well. There's a lot of great information. So your number one resource, of course, is Chabad.org. There's also a website that was put up with a colleague of mine and me personally called peacefulreturn.org. Or .com. It's the same thing. I think we have both. Peacefulreturn.org. I put it in the chat box. There's a 4-minute video that's very moving, a little dramatic thing. There's me speaking about it. It's a whole bunch of other things. It's an easy, quick thing. You can go a top 10 list. There's all different information there. My book on the subject is called Cremation or Burial, A Jewish View. You can get it online. It has all this and much more, stories and stats and things like that. And of course, the main resource for you to talk to is your Chabad rabbi locally, to get information. Now it's interesting just looking at some of the comments and the quotes. Robert, you just asked, is cremation against Jewish law? Absolutely. That's why I focused on the first thing, Rabbi Oshry, the whole Holocaust story. Very, very important part of Jewish law and Jewish tradition is to be buried. So the rabbis are kind of surprised. I can kind of tell, and some of the questions kind of imply it's funny that we hire, we asked this guy from Israel to come and speak about cremation, and he didn't actually give the main reason that our tradition gives for burial. Anybody notice that? Right? The number one reason that our tradition mentions, I have not said a word about, and that is because it sounds weird at first. Right? And what is that? Not the Holocaust, Larry, actually. I'm very much into Holocaust education. I actually, my side job before Corona is I'm a tour guide, and I used to, God willing, when Israel opens up, you're welcome to be in touch, and take you around Israel. I also guide in Poland. I've been to the camps many times, and famous Jewish communities, and I'm very much into Holocaust education. I take families and communities there. But the Holocaust was never the reason that Jews buried the dead. In fact, there's Holocaust survivors that are choosing cremation if it was good enough for, and I always explain to them, obviously we can't judge a Holocaust survivor, but that's like the final slap, the final, they killed us twice. Once physically killing us and then not allowing Jewish burial, and your relatives, what they wanted more than anything was to be buried, Jewishly. So to choose cremation because the Holocaust doesn't make sense. But that's not the main reason. The main reason our tradition gives is because of, get this, the resurrection of the dead. Sounds weird, right? When you think of the resurrection of the dead, do you, like me, like sometimes you think of zombies coming back or something? Like, we believe in that? Like, we're supposed to be the smart people. And the truth is, there's many beautiful ideas that, because of Hollywood, they're interpreted like they've taken like detours and they seem weird. The idea is like this, okay? Voltaire once said, "It is no more of a miracle to be born twice than born once." That's the idea that Voltaire said. That tradition says that there is a bone that's called the luz bone, L-U-Z in English. Some say it's like where the spine meets the the vertebrae over here. Some say it's the bottom. I personally think it's a bit of DNA. The DNA lasts forever unless you burn it in a crematory oven. There's no more DNA. I've checked this very carefully. The temperature is that high. If you take a seed and you put it into the ground, what happens? Beautiful plant grows, flower grows. You take a seed and you burn it and you put it into the ground. What happens? You hurt the ground. There's a soccer pitch in Scotland that doesn't allow people to scatter ashes because it's destroying the grass. Right? So DNA lasts unless you burn it. And it has a presence in the future. Raise your hand if you have ever visited a Jewish cemetery, a Jewish convent, or a Jewish monastery. Raise your hand if you've ever visited a Jewish convent or monastery, right? I know that nobody's going to raise their hand because there aren't any. It was a trick question. Why aren't there any? Catholics have them. What, you think they're stupid? They're not stupid. Why do they have them and we don't? Well, the answer is that there's a view of physical reality. If you ask a Catholic, with great respect, who the holiest person on the planet is, they'll probably say the Pope. The Pope is celibate. Nuns and priests are celibate. You ever wonder why? They're not stupid. It's a philosophy we disagree with, but it's a philosophy. Their idea is if you want to be spiritual, right, you have to fight the physical, ignore the physical, right? Don't get married. Don't be intimate with your spouse. Don't enjoy good food because the physical is bad. So therefore, in the Far East, life is life of suffering, right? So you can understand conceptually that, like, if the physical world is bad, like, who cares about the body, We think the physical world is good. God is a good God that gave a good world. You have to use it correctly, rider on the horse, not the horse on the rider. But the physical world is good and it has a role to play in the future. That's the resurrection of the dead. How that works and what that means, I don't understand. I don't really know if anybody really understands, except you, Rabbi. But but it's but it is an important part that we don't go out and destroy the physical body. We wait for it somehow to have a role to play. Okay, so how do you want to do more questions and comments?
I think that there are plenty of questions that people already posted, so I would take a look at some of them.
Great.
See, please answer respect parents' wishes or halacha.
Yes. Okay. So this is a very good one. It's a question that I get quite a bit. Like this. Very often, people will tell me, listen, I agree 100%, but what can I do? My parents, my spouse requested cremation. And isn't it right to give them their last wish? They asked me to do it, and I'm the executor, I'm just whatever. And, I notice in life that sometimes, like, deciding between like good and bad is relatively clear. Like, I'm not going to rob the bank, that's bad. But deciding between two good things is like the harder thing. Like a good thing of like burial and a good thing of listening to parents. Like, that's like, how do you judge? It's funny like that. So like this. when do you think I am closer to God and I have more clarity about life and about right and wrong? Now or when I'm upstairs? I mean, like after 120 years, heaven. I'm assuming heaven. I hope, but or this world. Well, I would think that it's going to be then, right? I mean, we're so distracted now. It's phone calls and texts and politics and health issues. Like there's so many, you can't even like in a moment to just think clearly and have a real conversation and learn and think and contemplate, right? Life is a world of this. Life is just so many distractions here. We don't have clarity. Upstairs, after 120 years, the physical distractions, the news, it's over. And I have much more clarity, and my knowledge of God is much higher. So when the person asked for cremation here in the world, and we're the ones who taught the world about listening to parents, honoring your parents. That's a Jewish concept, did not exist before us, right? So there's an exception to the rule. The exception to the rule is when they asked for cremation, why did they ask for cremation? You have to think about it. And in almost all cases, it's going to be based on misinformation. The environmental issues, they didn't want you to spend the money, they didn't want to be a burden, they didn't think that all the reasons that we went through. But if they understood what they understood now, that we're part of something much bigger than we realize. And our souls need this for passage to the next world, and our bodies need this, and our descendants are going to want this, right? They would have chosen burial. So I go with what deep down, this is an exception to the rule of listening, right? That if the deceased says, when I die, Doron, I want you to eat a bacon double cheeseburger on Yom Kippur, right? I don't listen to that. There are exceptions to that rule of listening. When a person is asking for something that is bad for their body, bad for their soul, and bad for the community, and bad for everything, we don't listen to it. It's an exception to the rule. Deep down, they wanted to do the right thing, and that's burial. Okay, I'm going into your comments and questions.
Somebody wrote about a wall in a cemetery. I think they're referring to a mausoleum. And,
yeah. So
and another question that a lot of people have was about a veteran cemetery, which is something that's very common here in Florida.
Yeah. So my oldest son, he should be well, is an officer in the Israeli army. He's been in the army for almost 5 years. He's got 30 troops under his command, a combat officer. I'm very, very connected to the military. My father-in-law served in the U.S. Army. I have great respect for the military, and I understand why somebody would want to be buried in a veterans in a military cemetery. Not just Arlington, by the way. That's just like the famous one, but they're all over the country. Unfortunately, in Israel, are all over the country too. And the answer is you can have your cake and eat it too. You talk to the rabbi. There are ways in many veteran cemeteries they've made that the rabbi can consecrate the land as being officially part of the Jewish cemetery. By the way, it's interesting that cemeteries are usually done by faith. You notice that? Try and be a Christian and get buried in a Muslim cemetery. It ain't gonna happen. Why is that? Because we're part of a community, right? And when we want to show that this community identity is who we are. So that's why a Jewish cemetery is very important. But there are ways of doing it. In Arlington, there's certainly ways of doing it, and in Israel, there's certainly ways of doing it, and all over America. So you talk to the rabbi, and you figure out how you can have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. If you needed to choose, if there's no option, then the identity of being a Jew, of this 3,000-year connection, is really that important to choose a Jewish cemetery. But in most cases, you don't have to choose. You can have your cake and eat it too. Okay, in terms of the above ground point, Judaism very much focuses on in-ground burial, back to the land, let nature take its course. When they do things above ground, is essentially to delay. We don't want to delay. We don't want to rush things. We don't want it to delay. I'll tell you something. I have never met somebody where they had a burial in the family and it disturbed the family dynamic. And it cremation does. And very often I hear that there's a sense of closure that they don't have, and there's pain. And when people do it right, it's like that story I told about the guy who spoke to his kids and said, "Listen, I may not have been the most religious person on the planet, but when I die, I want to be buried as Jews have been buried for thousands of years. My last statement on the planet, I'm proud to be a Jew. Just do it right. There's things here that have been done for thousands of years. Jews have sacrificed tremendously for this. There's reasons for all of these things. And so, yeah, do it right. Do an in-ground burial, right? Okay, people asked that someone said, Barbasla, how do we know Moses was buried? Look at the end of the Bible, the last chapter of the Torah. It makes it very clear, right? The whole Bible tells us about him, tells us what happened to the end. Someone said they don't feel much at a cemetery. Yeah, it's kind of funny. It's a personal thing. You notice there's no obligation to visit a cemetery. You don't have to. If you do and you connect to it, I actually do. I'm not a weirdo. Don't go every day, as I said, but I actually do connect to it. That's great. Some people don't. By the way, anybody know, like, has anybody ever experienced a bafustic? Anybody experienced a bafustic? Well, probably you don't know what I mean by a bafustic, right? So it's hard to know. Like, we don't know what it is to connect to the soul of the deceased. So very often a person will go to the cemetery and won't necessarily feel something. It doesn't mean you're not connecting. It just means you don't really know, how do I do that? Like, we don't believe that physical and spiritual are completely separate, right? That's the Catholic idea of the Pope is celibate. Why? Because spirituality and physicality are separate. You have to get away from physicality if you want to be spiritual. We actually say that the whole point of life is to bring spirituality, meaning, into the physical world, right? Bring God into this world. And so the physical body is good. And there's an energy there. Our tradition says that when the person dies, the soul does not depart its body immediately. Imagine the following. A woman has been married happily for 50 years. God forbid the husband dies. She gets back home from the funeral, takes off her black dress, puts on a red party dress, and that very night goes out to the clubs looking for a new guy. Does that sound normal to you? I mean, come on. Like, when you're attached to somebody, when you're a partner, you don't just move on. The body and soul are partners. They are not enemies. I could not give charity without my body. I could not have children without my body, right? So the body and soul are partners. And when the body dies, the soul doesn't just push it away and forget about it, right? During Shiva, during the 7 days of Shiva, the soul, our tradition says, it's funny, like, how like when you're a parent, you try and guide your children. So God did not leave us without guidance. Like, we were taught certain things. And we are taught in the mystical teaching of Judaism that when the soul and body separate, they stay together. Their physical separate. It's not inside the body anymore, but it stays together. And the soul goes back and forth from its body to the Shiva house, right? And always part of it stays connected to that burial place. So it's an important thing for the soul as well, aside of all these sociological and historical and everything reasons that we said. So going into the questions,
Someone asked if you're allowed to bury ashes.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Cremation fads come in and out. We think it's like this new thing. The Romans and Greeks cremated, and Jews were known as the ones who didn't. In the 1890s, there was a new technology of burning bodies in England, and Jews started to cremate as well in the 1890s, 130 years ago in England. And the rabbis came out and declared that it is absolutely forbidden to bury cremated remains in a Jewish cemetery. Now, if you think about it for a minute, that's actually very surprising, because can you go across the street and take a bit of dirt and put it into a Jewish cemetery, sure, it's just dirt. What's the problem? So cremated remains are not the person, right? If you're a Cohen, you all know that, like the Cohens, right? The father was a Cohen, the grandfather was a Cohen, right? You know, my wife comes from a family of Cohen. So, you know, I mean, a Cohen is not allowed to go in a cemetery in normal circumstances, right? And they avoid death, right? Because the point is that their role is supposed to be the most connected to life and service in the temple, and they avoid contact with death, right? In Israel, by the way, in the hospitals, when someone dies, they actually put up signs telling Kohanim not to enter the hospital. It's amazing how this is even to this day. So, you know, a Cohen can actually pick up an urn of cremated remains, no problem, because there's nothing left of that person. It's not the person. You're not taking a person with you, it's just dirt. There's no DNA. I've checked with forensics experts, right? They don't even like cremation because they can't trace anything. So the point is that why did the rabbis in England 130 years ago outlaw putting cremated remains into a cemetery? Like, it's just dirt. It doesn't mean anything. It's like any dirt. It's not the person. And the answer was they were trying to send a signal. They were trying to send a signal that cremation is not Jewish. And if we let you bury cremated remains, you're going to start to think that, okay, so burial, cremation, whatever, it's okay as long as I put them in a Jewish cemetery. And the rabbis didn't want us to make that mistake. So that's a hard one to deal with if you have the cremated remains of your loved one, and you know, theoretically you can say it's not him. But so what do I suggest you do with them? I suggest that if you have cremated remains of a loved one, technically there's no problem. Technically they're not the person. There's nothing left. It's just dirt. You can throw it out. But that's, I mean, come on, who's going to do that, right? I suggest you spread them on the ocean. I suggest you put them in a park when nobody's looking. Put them, you know, in the family plot of a cemetery. Doesn't matter. But don't use that as an excuse that, okay, so cremation is not so bad, you know, because I can always put, you know, we're treating those cremated remains respectfully for us, not for the person themselves. Okay, anything else, Rabbi, that you see that it's should focus on over here?
They were asking, there's a few questions about if someone donated organs, can they be buried?
Yeah. So, by the way, I see that a few people asked, I'm not sure if, it's clear enough that if burial is preferred or prohibited, burial is, that cremation is completely prohibited by Jewish law. I mean, there is no, it's a clear mitzvah commandment in Jewish law. For those who are interested, there's a core part of our tradition. There's no room there whatsoever. So that wasn't your question. I was just looking at the list, right then. So organs. Okay. So there is a organization, and you can take a note and write this down, or I'll put it in the chat if I can find it over here, called HODS, the Halachic Organ Donation Society. You can Google them, they have a website. What it basically does is the organ donation can be a big mitzvah, a really good deed, or a complete waste and a desecration of the body unnecessarily. It all depends why and how it's done. To just sign on your driving license that I'm going to give my organs, right? Many of them, most of them are not needed. They're not used. The body's not treated respectfully. I've checked this out very, very carefully. You can Google it and you can get into it, right? On the other hand, if there is actually a person that needs your organ and you can save their life, then absolutely you can give the organ. So what I suggest is you sign up for this, what's called HODS, the Halachic, that's the Jewish law, Organ Donation Society, if this is important to you, and you do it, but you do it within Jewish values and law, and they make sure that it's done right, it's done correctly, and it's done respectfully. It's only done when it's actually necessary, because the dirty secret of that whole thing is that there's a huge amount of just abuse, and it's not pretty. And by the way, same thing about donating to science. When I was growing up, there was thinking, donate your body to science. Ladies and gents, I've checked with the scientists. You may be some scientists. There is no need for you to donate your body to science. Simply no need. There's more than enough bodies. They use virtual simulations today in most cases anyway. Plenty for the doctors, the medical students to practice on. There's no need for it whatsoever. There's no demand. Put it that way. Okay. Why else is the Listen, you're saying it's not true right now. I've checked this out very, very carefully. You can Google this. There's no overall need for doing anything to science. Again, the Jewish view is very clear. We're into l'chaim. Right? If it's actually going to, it's hard to hear. Somebody's not on mute. But if there's actually a life to save, then of course we're the ones who taught the world that. But very often that is not the case. Someone said dogs. Yeah, well. There's no Jewish law against cremating dogs. I don't know. I would just sort of bury and let it let the body go back. But if that's okay. You can definitely be buried. And this is Diane. This is your original question on the subject. You ever hear this idea that if someone has a tattoo, they can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery? You ever hear that idea? My grandmother used to say, that's such a Baba Maisa, Baba Maisa, Baba's a grandmother, right? Maisa is like just a story. Like it's just some parent, father, mother, grandmother, grandfather didn't want their kid to get a tattoo. And so they made up this thing about not being buried in a Jewish cemetery. Okay. It's not true at all. Okay. By the way, we're not in favor of tattoos, but a person can be buried in the Jewish cemetery, no problem. And the same thing, by the way, with organ donors or things like that. Unfortunately, there have been many cases of victims of terrorism that don't have the full bodies, and they're all buried in Jewish cemeteries, right? There's no issue like that. In fact, there's a wonderful organization called Zaka. Boy, I could never do it. They're the guys. They're usually the Hasidic guys that after a terrorist act, God forbid, they're like scraping the streets to get all the little body parts and give it proper burial in like plastic bags. Every part of the body deserves burial, and they're very, very. They fly around the world helping people. They're very into it. Yes, Barb, you're right. Tattoos are prohibited, but I'm just saying that doesn't have to do with a cemetery, per se. There's no connection. What else?
Let me just give a moment for the Chabad rabbi in Puerto Vallarta.
Please.
To share his thank you on behalf of his community.
Aaron, I just want to say thank you to you. And I want to say thank you to the Ocala community, the villages, for allowing us to join you. I do want to say for the people that are on from Puerto Vallarta, we do have this conversation often, and it's something that we do discuss. As Daron said, so truly, we are in Mexico, on the west coast of Mexico, and when we moved here, there was no possibility for somebody who passes to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, because the closest Jewish cemetery is many, many, many hours away. And it is possible, but very difficult. And most of the Americans and Canadians that live here, they don't want to pay for the exorbitant fee of sending a body across international borders. So one of the first things that we did do when we were here was create a Jewish cemetery. And there is a Jewish cemetery now in Puerto Vallarta. And what I found, and I've heard Daron talk about this at other times, what I found very interesting, because I want to just mention it, is that already 10 Jews here in Puerto Vallarta who told me they want to be cremated and who have changed their plans and have bought a plot in the new Jewish cemetery. What I found very interesting is that once they made that decision, it has affected their overall connection with Judaism in a very powerful way. I heard Daron talk about this at a different occasion, but I think that it's an important point that should be mentioned, and that is that it's not just a decision about afterlife, because when somebody makes a decision like this, it really has an effect on their present and current situation as a Jew. You feel more connected to your people, you feel more connected to your religion, and it's a really it's a powerful point, and it's also a very powerful message to your children. I know people are always looking to people that donate money to synagogues and other things often tell me that I want my children to see where my values are, or people that do other things. They tell me, somebody here donated a Torah, and he's not a wealthy person. It's not a wealthy couple at all, just a hardworking couple. And I asked them why they did it. They said that they wanted to send a message to their children where their values are. And I think that this is another another idea and another concept that hasn't been discussed. And that is that when you make a decision like this, you're really sending a very powerful Jewish message to your family, to your children, and more importantly, to yourself. And this is really, if you think about it, all of us care about Jewish continuity. Whether you get cremated, whether you get buried, not whether you do it, but whatever you have in mind, you may not be thinking about the consequences of those actions. And realizing that this plays a very powerful, integral, important role, not only in your children's life, in the place where your children see your Jewish values, but also in your own life. I think it's another important point that should be mentioned. Thank you, Doron. I appreciate it.
Beautiful, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to to call it a night. I put in the chat a few resources for you if you want more information. Obviously, talk to your Chabad rabbis. That's the main source of information. Chabad.org has a tremendous amount on this subject. Peacefulreturn.org or .com is only on the subject. It's short, interesting things. If you are interested, you can get my book, Cremation or Burial, A Jewish View. It's a great conversation starter on the dining room table and the coffee table. And to get you thinking, it's got the stories and the stats and everything like that and a lot more information. So that's if you want more information. Again, what we did was sort of 3 sections. We discussed why people today are choosing cremation, and the reasons fall away. They're not true, except for the cost. It is usually more expensive. The rabbi mentioned that if that's an issue, talk to them. And I was making a case as to my understanding of why Jews have been so strong on burial, surprisingly strong on burial for thousands of years. And this is not, as some people say, like the Fiddler on the Roof, tradition. It's not just because of tradition. That's why we went through and tried to understand why. Why is our tradition so strong on this issue? And we discovered that it is a core part of mitzvah commandment, strong, in terms of our religion. This is healthy for societies to deal with it, what the soul needs, the environment, all the different things that we talked about. The final thing that we talked about was this idea of this older Jewish guy who just says, listen, I may not have been the perfect Jew, but I'm a proud Jew, and I want my last statement on planet Earth to be that I'm a proud Jew. So I connected that a lot. Thank you very much. Since I think our questions, if I can end with one question that I have, Rabbi, is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
So it's now 3:30 a.m. here in Israel, and I am fully awake. What am I supposed to do now? There's no way I'm going to fall back asleep now. We're in lockdown here. I can't do anything, and we're in lockdown. Yeah,
you can talk on here for the next 3 hours.
There you go. Thanks, everybody. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. I want to just add one more quick thing, and that is that some people were asking about if they have a plot in another location, like in New York or New Jersey. Talk to me about it, and I can help you with being transferred to that place. It's very simple. We've done it for many people, and it's very easy to be arranged. So if you do have a plot somewhere else, it's definitely something that's relatively easy. Thank you so much, Doron. We really appreciate it. And as someone mentioned, you have the same name as the guy in Fauda. Someone wrote in one of the comments. So keep the fighting spirit, just like the guy in Fauda. And thank you so much.
Have a great evening.
Thanks for incredible work.
Okay, thanks so much. Bye, everybody.